All right, let's go ahead and gather together, and I hope you have your thinking caps on and you're just ready to listen tonight. Thanks for being here, and I really think this is of the Lord that He's given us this opportunity, so we're very grateful for this. I've known for several years Pastor Gary Click, who also happens to be a representative, and he has been a friend and an encouragement, known mainly through Chad Conley, who many of you have met, and through our mutual heart for what's going on here in Ohio. But he called me on Wednesday and said, hey, I have this opportunity, and would you be interested? And so it took a little bit to think on that and just develop it. And so here we are tonight. Mr. Uri is here with us from Israel. He was here to update the House of Representatives, but he is a tour guide over there and very well established at that, and I think we're going to learn a lot. So our heart is just to hear his perspective tonight, to learn some things, and then I really want to encourage you to be able to share that with other folks. We live in kind of a crazy day where there's a lot of misinformation, so let's do our best to gather, write down things. I'll have my notes out and ready to write down things, so I encourage you to do that. But Gary Click's going to help me introduce Uri. Yuri and I just met for the first time today, and I appreciate that. I hope someday we get to meet in Israel. That would be a wonderful thing. But yes, that would be wonderful. But Gary, would you just introduce him and kind of set up the evening for us?
Thank you. So first of all, you have an awesome pastor. I love your pastor is one of my best friends, and I know that you appreciate him because you get to enjoy him every Sunday. But I want you to know that he is respected across the state of Ohio. There are many other pastors that look up to him and that respect him and he is an influential person in Ohio. And he has made a huge difference in many ways. And I know some of you came along with him to Columbus on some very important legislation. And God, I want you to know God used that moment. And he used it in a tremendous way. And so thank you for loving your pastor. Thank you for being faithful to your pastor. Thank you for praying for your pastor. And thank you for letting me borrow him once in a while. I want you to say, you ever see something that's really cool and you go, ooh. You know what I'm saying? So everybody go, ooh.
I can't stop this thing.
Now go, re. Uri. That's our guest, Uri. And so once in a while I'd get it wrong. Sometimes I like Uri. Yeri. I had somebody call him Ernie last night. So it's just think about something that's really cool, and you go, Uri. So it's Uri. And in 2018, I was serving on the Republican State Central Committee. As your pastor mentioned, I'm a state representative. Now, my first calling, by the way, is I'm a pastor. But I was serving on the Republican State Central Committee, and I had an opportunity to go to Israel for free with a group called AIPAC, American Israeli Political Action Committee. And it was a group of Christians from different denominations and different streams, per se, of Christianity that had some political influence across the Midwest. We were all invited to go. And so it was really a diplomatic trip that we went on. And we saw so much. We got to meet some high-level officials within Israel, but then we also got to see the holy sites, and our tour guide was Uri. Did I say that right? No. How do you say that? He says I embarrass him too much. And I'm going to embarrass him just a little bit more here in a second. Because, and it'll be over. So you can plug your ears if you want to, Uri. But Uri is rated as one of the top 10 tour guides, and there's about 3,000 tour guides. He's rated as one of the top 10 tour guides in Israel. Uri has served in the IDF, active for several years, and then in the reserves as a paratrooper. He is a scholar. He's an adjunct professor, and he knows what he's talking about in every aspect of the word. So if you want to know historically about the Middle East, which he'll tell you about, and you'll get it when he tells you, he can tell you. He can tell you about all the surrounding nations. He can tell you the history of Israel. He can talk to you about the culture of Israel, and he can talk to you about religion as well. And so when we went from top to bottom in Israel and from side to side. We saw every aspect, and for 10 days we were in Israel, and there was no downtime. When you get up and you're eating breakfast, someone is talking to you, and they're lecturing us. And when I say lecturing us, I mean in a good way, not in a bad way. Not the way your parents lecture you or you lecture your children. Okay, that's not what I'm talking about. But we were being advised by high-level people in Israel. And then we're on the bus, we're going somewhere, and he said, outside this window is this, and you're going through here now. And sometimes it was Uri, sometimes it was someone else. And we learned so much all through that trip. And I came back, and my life was changed just by being in the Holy Lands and because of some of the things that Uri taught me. And Uri is Jewish, and so it's very interesting to hear some of the things and about some of the places and all the heroes that we have from the scriptures from a Jewish perspective. It really enlightened my understanding of the Word of God and what's going on in the Middle East and in Israel very specifically. But we all know that there was a tragedy that took place on October the 7th. And so Uri has been here in the States for a couple weeks, and this is his third trip, and he's enlightening churches and legislators. I had him speak to some of the members of our legislature last Wednesday. He spoke to my church this morning. He spoke to another church in Columbus last Tuesday, and he's been in Michigan, that state up north. And he's going tomorrow. He's leaving to go to Texas. And the message that he has is one that helps us to fulfill God's command to pray for Israel, to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And we can pray better when we can pray informed. And it's not just a generic prayer, but it's a very specific prayer. And as Uri tells you these things, I want you to understand, for us, we see it on the news and we say, oh, that's too bad what's happening over there. Some of the people directly affected by this are his friends. We see it as a news story. Oh, they kidnapped these people. Oh, these people died. That's too bad. Uri's like, I can't pick up the phone and call my friend anymore. So I want you to understand, this is not just an intellectual briefing, although this will challenge your mind and your knowledge, but it's also very personal, and it's going to help us to understand. And so I'm going to just ask you tonight if, first of all, jot down some questions. We'll have a Q&A time afterwards. But I want you to give Uri your undivided attention tonight as he comes and speaks to you about Israel. Uri, thank you for being here. God bless you, brother.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No, but you hyped it up. I can go now because everybody's... Is my mic on? Is it okay? Okay. Hi, everybody. And thank you very much for welcoming me into your church. It's really a pleasure to be here. Pleasure is not the right word because I'd rather be home. But it's an honor to be here. This is my third trip, as Pastor Gary had just mentioned. It's my third trip to the U.S. since the beginning of the war. I started this mission. I started this journey because, for two main reasons. One, my entire calendar was wiped clean, right? And I have to pay rent and feed my children, and I need to find a way to do that. If people couldn't come to Israel, I thought I can bring Israel to them. But secondly, and as I found out even more importantly, I found out when I was traveling to the United States, everywhere I went, I was welcomed with warm hearts and open arms. And that struck me very, very deeply because in Israel, the general feeling of most people is that we're all alone. That we have no friends left. That the world has turned against us as the world has turned against Jews for the last 3,000 years. And being here and visiting churches and elected members of legislation and leaders and even people in people's homes and gatherings and feeling that warmth made me realize that not only are we not alone, but the majority of Americans stand by Israel. The majority of Americans have a love for Israel, or at the very, very least understand that by standing by Israel, they are serving the American interest. That is part of our shared values, our Judeo-Christian value system, and the idea that Israel and the United States are on the same side of history. But that proclivity to support Israel doesn't translate into public opinion. It doesn't percolate up to decision makers. And the reason is, at least by my understanding, is that the images and the accusations against Israel are so horrible, it's hard to mitigate these two things. It's very hard to say, I love Israel, I support Israel, and then see the terrible images coming out of Gaza and the accusations against Israel of genocide and apartheid and colonialism, and then say, I stand with that. And so most people choose to remain silent. Or they choose a safe path and say, well, I want peace. So let's have a ceasefire. Let's just stop the war. And those things work against us. So I find that this is my journey and my calling to help you mitigate this gap, to give you the language and the tools and the understandings so you can, as Pastor said, speak out and pray informatively. And amongst your colleagues and your friends and your kids who just come back from college with really strange ideas, and you can actually talk to them intelligently in order to inform them and help them see the reality. I find that, can I have the presentation up? Once. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I find that one of the biggest, well, let's start with background and context. So with your permission, I would like to spend a little bit of time, not a lot, just a little bit of time, going over some of the geographic and the historical data points that brought us to this place. Because most people talk about Israel. It seems that the entire world has an opinion about Israel. They can't find Israel on the map. Right? They don't know where it is. And Pastor shared the map of the Promised Land. This is a geopolitical modern map. This is not the land that is promised. Here we distinguish between biblical land of Israel and the modern day state of Israel. It's that tiny dot in the middle. And I understand why people can't find it, because it's in somewhere called the Middle East. But as you can see, the Middle East is not in the middle and not in the east. So what is it? It's this very big chunk of land between the British Isles and India. It's on the way, it's in the middle of the way towards the east, which was the British name for this massive land. And all the countries, all the lines you see on this map were drawn where? In an office, not on the ground. I can tell you that. Those lines don't appear on the ground. What city were they drawn in? When you see straight lines on a map, you can make this assumption. In an office in London. Right? In an office in London on a map, that's where they draw these lines to create the new Middle East in the days after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. World War I is the end of the age of empires. And countries are now organizing around the new geopolitical construct of nation states. And the whole of the Ottoman Empire is divided into new nation states, usually in the interests of the European powers, namely Britain and France. And that tiny little dot in the middle, the center of that area, is what will become Israel in a region which was called Palestine. How small is it? It's almost 5 times smaller than Ohio. It actually, Israel fits into Lake Erie. Like it literally, the size of the lake is bigger than the whole country. Okay, and Ohio is 5 times bigger. That's the magnitude. That's 10 million people that are concentrated in this piece of land, and that's what we're talking about. And the size of it is very, very important. The width of it, at this narrowest point, is 9 miles. That's it. 9 miles. We'll talk a little bit about that. But that's very, very important to understand the mindset of Israelis. Again, the media portrayal is often not only skewed, but the opposite. In the mindset in the academia for the last several decades, since 1967 definitely, Israel has been taught as the regional power, as the strong side in the equation. Israelis see themselves as the weak part of the equation, the minority. A small group of 6.5, 7 million Jews in a sea of 300 million Arabs. Okay, with indefensible borders. Sometimes they're called Auschwitz borders. But this is the neighborhood. Right, this is the neighborhood, and there in the middle part, you see the countries of Israel and Jordan. This is the area that was called Palestine. Where does that name come from? It's Roman. This is the Roman name to the region from the 2nd century. Emperor Adrian, with an H, renamed Judea. Right, when you read the Bible, the Old Testament, it's the tribes of Israel, the kingdom of Judea, the kingdom of Israel. You know the northern kingdom. You know all the tribes that are divided, all the ancient maps, and even old maps from the 18th, 19th, 17th century will have the tribes of Israel delineated. There'll also be a little bit in the corner, they'll call it Palestine. Why? Because when Adrian kicked out the Jews from Judea after yet another Jewish revolt, those pesky Jews keep rebelling against Rome. When you come to Israel and you travel, I'll tell you why that's so significant to the birth of Christianity. That clash. Jews rebel against Rome, and yet again, Adrian comes and squashes that rebellion with an iron fist. He will kill more than 500,000 Jews. He will enslave the rest and scatter them all over the empire. That's why there are Jewish communities all over the world, because of Adrian. And he'll erase the name Judea from the maps and rename it after an ancient foe, an enemy of the Hebrew tribes from the Bible, the Philistines. Provincia Palestina is the Roman name for this region, and it's the name that the Europeans continue to use until this very day. When the Arabs came in the 7th century, 500 years later, they didn't call it Palestina. There's no P in Arabic. Okay, that's the name that is used today. When the British took over this land, they received from the League of Nations after World War I the mandate to create sovereign states. They promised the Arabs, for their cooperation in the First World War, in their defeat of the Ottomans, a kingdom. Where? In Palestine. The Arabs from Arabia, from Mecca. They promised the Jews, in support of the Jews in the British effort in World War I, to recognize a Jewish homeland. Where? In Palestine. The Balfour Declaration is the Foreign Office declaration. His Majesty's government sees favorably the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The Jews and the Arabs get the same promise from the British, and the British will spend the next 30 years trying to untangle the mess that they created. They will fail. They will fail because they will come to the conclusion that the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs is intractable. Lord Bevan, who's now the foreign minister, will stand up in the Parliament in London and will say, we have come to the conclusion that the conflict between the Jews and the Arabs is intractable. While the Jews, the Zionist movement, have an organizing principle of creation of a Jewish state, of independence and sovereignty, the Arabs' organizing principle is to prevent the Jews from having an independent state and sovereignty. That is, we're not talking about two national movements both vying for the same land, just arguing what they call the border. We're talking about one movement that wants to create a state and another movement that's trying to prevent the first from creating a state. It's intractable. And so the British said, we're done. We don't want to do this anymore. And they handed back the mandate to now the UN, who succeeded the League of Nations. The UN will send a delegation to Palestine and will come up with a partition plan. It's not the first, it's the second partition plan. By the way, the British have already divided the mandate. They gave the whole part, which is east of the River Jordan, to the Arabs. That's what they promised they'll do, remember? By the way, if anyone wants to see this on the screen, there's a movie called it's with Omar Sharif and Peter O'Toole. Lawrence of Arabia, thank you very much. Lawrence of Arabia tells the story. They create the kingdom of Transjordan on the other side of the River Jordan. What's left is west of the River Jordan, between the river and the sea. 2 states will be created. Israel's borders have changed over the years. Again, this is not the promised land. As the map that Pastor showed earlier, it's the modern geopolitical state of Israel. The blue parts are for the Jews, the brown parts are for the Arabs. The Jews accept, the Arabs reject, and a war breaks out. That war begins as a civil war. The British are still there. The Jews and the Arabs are fighting each other. People run away from war. So many Arabs flee. But the Jews don't have anywhere to go. It's 3 years after the Holocaust. Actually, many Jews are coming to the newborn state of Israel because they don't really have anywhere to go. The result is that the Arabs lose, and they lose big time. The northern part, the Galilee, is lost to Israel. Many of the Arabs that lived there either fled to Lebanon, became refugees until this very day, and those that stayed became Israeli citizens. The central part was lost to the Transjordan kingdom. The kingdom of Transjordan invaded the newborn state of Israel, captured the mountain area. They did not proceed to create a new Arab state, but they annexed this area to Transjordan, changed the name of Transjordan to Jordan with an east bank and a west bank. That's where the name comes from. Right? It's on the east side of the country, but it's the West Bank. It's the Jordanian name. Today, Palestinians don't like this name very much. But they kept a hold on to this land. They annexed it for the next 19 years. It became part of Jordan. And the southern area was lost to Egypt. Egypt captured that area. It shrunk dramatically, did not create an Arab state, but kept occupying the area for the next 19 years. And so we have it that for 19 years, both Jordan and Egypt occupied what should have become an Arab state or a Palestinian state, did not create a state, but kept it for themselves. In 1967, Israel triples in size. The 6 Days War. The 6-Day War is a phenomenal victory. It's a phenomenal victory that nobody believed would be possible. Even the Israelis didn't believe it would be possible. Honestly, a miracle in our lifetime. Pastor was talking earlier about the fulfillment of prophecy and how the words of the Bible are coming true in front of your eyes. You can't travel through Israel, read the Bible, and not see them manifest in front of you. And so the 67 war, the 6-Day War, was seen by many as the hand of God that reached down and provided us with this victory. Still, the territory that was won was not intended to stay at Israel's hand. They were intended to be a negotiation chip for future peace with the Arab neighbors in a land for peace formula. We give land and we receive peace. That's the exchange. That's the deal. We reached that deal in 1979 when we gave up the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians. And we signed a peace treaty with Egypt. We gave up all of Sinai and got peace from Egypt. These are the borders of Israel today. For the first time after 67, Israelis felt a sense of security, a sense of safety, a sense of self-confidence. And I would add also a sense of arrogance. I know you don't believe me because none of you have ever met an arrogant Israeli. You just got to have to trust me about that. But that arrogance cost us dearly in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. And that was the biggest tragedy that befell Israel until October 7th. 50 years. And then October 7th became worse. Still, we still needed to solve the problem of the West Bank and Gaza, a very large hostile population. They don't want us to control their lives. And so Israel was trying to figure out a way to allow them to be independent so we don't have to control their lives anymore. After several failed attempts, the Oslo Accords were born in 1993. This deal was hammered out in Norway in a back channel negotiation, even without the knowledge of the Prime Minister. But when it finally came forward, they decided to go for it. It was signed on the White House lawn in September of 1993. And the idea behind it was relatively simple. The idea behind it was that we can't really talk about the big issues. Every time we sit down with the Palestinians to talk about Jerusalem, borders, settlement, refugees, the negotiations explode. There's no moving forward. And so in Norway they said, look, let's put those aside for a second. By the way, it's a very, very logical, very neat way of doing business, and it's very common in the West to handle negotiations this way, and that makes sense. Let's put the big issues on the side. Let's not talk about them for 5 years. In these 5 years, we will do nation building. We'll help the Palestinians build institutions, a parliament, a national authority, banks, security, education systems. We will facilitate agreements on the small things. Let's talk about sewage. Right? We're in the same land. Let's talk about sewage. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about Wi-Fi and radio frequencies. Let's talk about tax and tariffs, labor laws, transportation, communication abilities. Let's talk about all the things that we can talk about without leading to a breakdown of negotiations. And then after 5 years, there'll be enough trust between the sides. Everybody will have a lot to lose. So when we go talk about the big issues, right? Refugees, Jerusalem, borders, settlements, then we'll be able to reach an agreement. It made sense. And so we started right away. In 1995 was Oslo II, and Israel withdrew from the city centers, handed over 85% of the Palestinian population, and creation of the Palestinian Authority, an autonomous government. For the first time in history, the Arabs, who are called Palestinians, have self-government. Yasser Arafat was in charge of all that. But already then there were problems. There was resistance. There were terror attacks, bus bombs, suicide attacks from the Palestinian side. Israel also lost a prime minister at the hands of a Jewish extremist who didn't want the prime minister to give up land he considered to be sacred land. And so by 2000, Prime Minister at this time now, Ehud Barak, felt that the time is slipping away. He got together with Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat at Camp David and hammered out a final deal. And this time he put all of the demands on paper. And he gave the Palestinians pretty much their entire checklist. In some cases, even more. In exchange, he asked Arafat to sign the bottom line, that this is the end of the conflict, that there will be no more demands. Arafat walked away from the table. You see, Ehud Barak figured, if we're in a land for peace formula, and we're now giving up all the land, then we want all the peace. Right? That means that there's no more war. You have to sign that it's the end of the conflict. There'll be no more demands. And we can move forward with our lives. Yasser Arafat said, I can only represent the Palestinian people, but not the great Muslim nation. Which means that I can't give up the right of future generations to further resist the existence of the State of Israel. Remember the organizing principles that the British already identified in 1947? We have one group who wants to create a state, and another group who wants to prevent the first group from creating a state. End of the conflict negates this principle. So Arafat walked away. It's not me saying this. Bill Clinton, Condoleezza Rice are both in their memoirs, and now I hear Hillary Clinton is also repeating the story. This is what happened, with the result not being a counter offer by Arafat, but what we call today the Second Intifada. Have you heard this word, Intifada? Where did you hear it? On college campuses. They're shouting Intifada. Do you know what it means? It's okay, they don't either. They're shouting words they don't understand. They're shouting, no two-state solution, Intifada revolution. Or globalize the Intifada. Intifada means chaos. uprising, bring down the government. And this is what it looks like. During the 5 years between 2000 and 2005, 1,500 Israelis were murdered in such attacks. Suicide bombers, suicide murderers, I should say, on buses, school buses, coffee shops, pizza parlors, kids' birthday parties, drive-by shootings, car rammings, stabbings. That's what intifada means. And that's what they want to bring to American streets. Israel was able to stop the intifada by doing two things. One, go back into the heart of the territory we've given up to take control again of those areas that became centers of terrorism, hubs of terrorism. So we sent the army back into places we've already evacuated. And the second thing is build a barrier, a fence that surrounds the West Bank and prevents would-be suicide bombers to simply walk across the border and blow themselves up on an Israeli street. That's what the media sometimes call the wall. In some places it's a wall, it's mostly a fence. So this two-pronged approach, physical presence on the ground and a physical barrier, is what stopped and ended and brought us to win over the Intifada. The year is 2005. The Prime Minister is now Ariel Sharon. But we still have a problem because Gaza is still a very big, unsustainable problem for Israel. In Gaza, there are close to, at that time, 1.8 million Palestinian, Arabs, and about 20 Israeli settlements. Several thousand Israelis with almost the same number of soldiers that protect them. And Ariel Sharon, who was considered a hawkish right-winger, comes to the conclusion that this is not sustainable. We must withdraw from the Gaza Strip, but he wants to make it bigger. He wants to comply with what the world has been demanding of Israel for years, to redeploy on the internationally recognized border, the Green Line. This is internationally recognized since 1948. In parentheses, I would add, that means that all the towns and villages that were attacked in October 7th were in undisputed territory. Sometimes the talking heads on the news or the Hamas apologists would say, oh, what do you want? It's been 75 years of occupation. Nonsense. That's a lie. That is a blatant untruth. That area has been Israel and recognized as Israeli for 75 years. And since 2005, there's also no presence of Israelis in the Gaza Strip. Israel pulled out the entire civilian population and all the soldiers from the Gaza Strip and redeployed on the international border. We pulled out the living and the dead because we know what Muslims might do to Jewish cemeteries, so we exhumed their bodies and reburied them inside of Israel. Redeployed on the international border, leaving the entire agricultural and industrial infrastructure intact. The Palestinians could have been exporting cherry tomatoes, strawberries, and tulips to Holland within a week. They didn't. They destroyed it all and built a terror base. It's tragic. It's beyond tragic because they are such resilient people. They are smart people. They are talented. They have the skills, the know-how, the ability. They have the investors waiting. Just make a choice. Our Bible talks about choices. God places a choice in front of the children of Israel. I give before you the choice of life or death, of good or evil. It's there. You choose. It's in this week's Torah portion that Jews will read in all synagogues around the world. If you follow this path, you will have good life. If you follow this path, it would lead to destruction. There's always a choice. They chose to turn Gaza, instead of from a paradise, into a base of terror. In 2006, there were elections in the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat died 2 years earlier in 2004. Abu Mazen will win. He's Arafat's number 2. He won the presidency, but the Hamas won the popular vote. Hamas won the popular vote in 2006. By the way, Abbas is now in the 19th year of a 4-year term. But Hamas won the popular vote. Jimmy Carter was there. Jimmy Carter was there to oversee the elections, and he wrote that they were fair and square. He signed off on the elections, fair and square, no tampering, it's all good. But he too was surprised. He wrote that he was shocked, actually, that the Palestinians elected Hamas. Because everybody knows, he said, that Hamas is a rejectionist organization, that Hamas doesn't believe in peace, that Hamas believes in violent resistance and fighting against Israel to replace Israel, not to sit side by side with Israel in peace. It didn't make sense to him that the people he thought are peace-loving and support living side by side in peace with Israel will choose such an organization. And then he gave an answer to this question. It was the wrong answer. But Jimmy Carter said the reason that the Palestinians chose Hamas is because they were tired of the corruption of the Palestinian Authority. Right? This is the guy who said that everything was fair and square, right? But it's the corruption of the Palestinian Authority that drove Palestinians to the arms of Hamas. It's that corrupt Palestinian Authority which is still in charge today. 19 years later, same people, worse corruption. Jimmy Carter did what we call, my colleague Nat Wilf, Dr. Nat Wilf, calls this Westsplaining. It's like mansplaining, but it's when Westerners explain away poor behavior of non-Western people because it suits their needs. It's the subtle racism of diminished expectations. It's a racism of low expectations. It's like saying, oh, they don't know what they're doing. Pretending that they don't read Arabic and don't know what Hamas is all about. But they know. They know very well. In 2007, Hamas take over the Gaza Strip in a violent coup. When I mean violent coup, with guns. They go up to the rooftops, they take the Palestinian Authority clerics and clerks and throw them off rooftops. They shoot them in the streets, them and their families. The Palestinian Authority officials run away from Gaza into Israeli arms for safety. At first, it looks like a ragtag group of thugs. This would have been a great opportunity for USA Today to take a deep dive into what is Hamas, to tell the world what this organization is. Missed opportunity. They didn't do that. From a ragtag group of thugs, it turns into this. Nuremberg. Gaza becomes Hamas, Hamas becomes Gaza. Everything in Gaza is controlled by Hamas. They take over the social networks, they take over the mosques, they take over the schools, the UN-run schools, the aid organizations, the border crossings. They tax everything, overground and underground, and they start immediately to build an underground infrastructure. For the next 16 years, they will invest billions of dollars. Some dollars that came directly as aid for the Palestinians, concrete, that's supposed to build schools and clinics would be used to build tunnels, under hospitals and under clinics. Who are Hamas? Why are they so dedicated to this? Well, in their words. And I recommend, when you have time and patience with a cup of coffee, to look up the Hamas Charter. I use the translation from Yale University Avalon Project, but there are others. This is a good translation. They have many historical documents. This is only one of them. Hamas is often mistaken as another Palestinian faction that are fighting Israel for independence. This is a mistake. It's a fallacy. Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Islamic Brotherhood. Islamic Brotherhood is an organization that was established in the early 20th century in Egypt, whose stated goal is to export the Islamic revolution, Sharia law, and the radical interpretation of Islam to the whole world and create a global caliphate. This is their goal. For Hamas, The Palestinian cause is only a vehicle, only a stepping stone, a springboard to export the Islamic revolution. They're jihadists. And which is the word people use a lot these days. But I want you to understand what this means. The Hamas charter is almost copy-paste, or has many parts of it that are copy-pasted from Mein Kampf, which is Hitler's main book, and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a Russian forgery that pretty much blamed the Jews for running a global conspiracy to bring down everybody else. According to Hamas, the Jews are responsible for the French Revolution, for the Russian Revolution, for World War I, World War II. Through the banks, they control the banking and control the world. Through the media, they control the world. They sit in their country clubs and conspire to control the world and bring everybody down. In Rotary clubs and Freemasons, and it's like, they're playing golf in their country clubs and then having coffee and conspiring how to bring down the rest of the world. It is so full of hate and vilification of Jews, there's only one solution. First of all, obliterate Israel. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until it is obliterated by Islam as the ones became before. The Jews are considered usurpers, crusaders, invaders, colonizers. And the only solution is to kill them all. All of them, not just in Israel, but all over the world. It's a genocidal charter that they state clearly as part of their raison d'être, as their reason to be and their goals. And how will they do this? Allah is the goal, the Prophet its model, the Quran its constitution, jihad is the path. And death for the case of Allah is the most sublime belief. This is not hyperbole. It's not dramatic for political gain. This is what they actually believe. In the West, we lack the language to really understand. And even when we understand the words, it's very hard to us to compute the meaning of these words. So please forgive me, but this must be understood. When they say the death, and for the case of Allah, is a sublime goal, they mean that they want to get to paradise. That the life here, our bodies here, are meaningless. Our physical lives here are inconsequential. Life starts at death. And then you get to paradise. You get to the bosom of Allah and the Prophet. But you can't get there just because. Only if you're innocent. Who are the innocents? Children. Listen closely. So if the children die as innocents, they go straight to paradise. You've just done them a favor. What's the next best way? With the blood of the martyrs on your hands. With the blood of the infidel on your hands after you've killed them. That's why they use the bloodied hand symbol. You've seen that sometime in social media. They use a bloodied hand symbol. They say it's to stop the war. It's the opposite. It's the bloodied hand with the blood of the infidel that is the sign that they can now go to paradise. Which is why for Hamas, if the children die, it's not that terrible. It's why you'll find an ISIS suicide bomber walking into a mosque in Afghanistan, blowing himself up and killing 182 people. How does that make sense? He just killed other Muslims. Why does that make sense? Because he just sent them to paradise as martyrs. Because their lives here are meaningless. People who are religiously illiterate, which is most of the people in the West today, unfortunately, will not understand this. We find it hard to believe that there are people around us in this world who don't want what we want for our children. Right? We want our children to be safe and happy and grow up to be successful and healthy in mind and body and have families of their own and be useful members of society. That's what you want for our children. Well, not everybody in this world wants that for the children. Some of them want their children to reach paradise as quickly as possible. So when Hamas uses the strategy of hiding behind civilians to maximize civilian casualties when they put weapons caches, rocket launchers in kindergartens, in scouts troops offices, in schools and classrooms, knowing that when those rockets fire, the counteroffensive will destroy that building and children will die. They're doing that with a deliberate intention. A, it's not that terrible from their perspective because all those people who are dying are going to heaven. And B, the world will blame Israel because of our sensitivity to the loss of human life. It's our shared values. It comes from the book because we were all created in God's image. And we all believe there's no monetary value to human life. And we all believe in the sanctity of human life. That human life, that the man and woman are the epitome of creation. We inversed the pagans' world pyramid, where the human beings were at the bottom, serving the gods, and it had no consequence, to putting humans on top, to have been created in the image of God. We're dealing with an ancient belief system that predates Islam, and Islam was grafted onto it, which is medieval. It's more than medieval. We'll get to that later. Without understanding this fundamental issue about what Hamas is, what radical Islam is, what jihadism is, we will fail to understand what we're up against. And I want to make it also very, very clear. This is not all Muslims. Not at all. In fact, it's not even the majority of Muslims. You probably have neighbors who are Muslims, who don't accept this ideology. That's the majority of Muslims around the world. Only 25-30% of Muslims can be defined or will define themselves as such, as believe in this doctrine. And polls in many Arab and Muslim countries. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world. If 25-30% believe in this ideology, you can do the math. It's still a big issue. It's a big problem for us to face. But make no mistake, the people who suffer the most from radical Islam are Muslims themselves. The magnitude of the events of October 7th created a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is something that is so, it's so dramatic that it changes the way we view the world. It changes our presuppositions. It changes the view, the paradigm, the assumptions that we use to determine reality or determine policy. That was the magnitude of the events. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because this is a holy place. But we need to understand what happened there. We're talking about events that are so horrible, so malevolent, it shocked Israelis to the core. We're talking about events that we haven't seen. We've seen movies. It's like Game of Thrones and medieval things that we've seen. Roman cruelty. That's the level. But maybe the worst thing is that they videotaped it. They broadcasted it themselves with GoPros and cell phones. They uploaded it to their own social media. And for the people that watched in these videos, what struck them the most, beyond the horror of it, was the glee and the joy with which they carried out these acts, these horrific atrocities. We say that it takes a village to raise a child. What does it take to raise an army of 40,000 murderer rapists? Dismember children and behead innocent people and steal them from their beds. Burn families alive. Rape, pillage, kill. Not hyperbole. Not being overdramatic. It's what happened. You can take a picture of this screen. I'm not going to share the images with you. But take a picture of the screen and then put it in your hidden folders, photos. I do recommend watching the YouTube movie Screams Before Silence. It doesn't have gruesome images. It doesn't have anything graphic. It has testimonies. It's important to view. It's important to view to understand what happened that day. And all the rest of these websites, I urge you never to look at them. Don't look at them. You don't need to look at them. But you need to keep them somewhere where you can one day pull them out, because you will meet somebody who will tell you it never happened. There are already people who are saying it didn't happen. This is the most documented atrocity in modern times, and there are already people who are saying it didn't happen. Or Israelis did it to themselves. It was a false flag operation. The Israelis killed their own so they can have an excuse to go and attack Gaza. Or, if you push them, it was justified. And then you'll know who your friends are when they justify these atrocities. Most of the children have been returned after 51 days. The two in the middle, that's Kfir and Eitan Bibas, the redheads. One was kidnapped when he was 8 months old, and the other is 4 years old, a toddler. They have still not been returned. The changes that occurred on the ground changed the way Israelis think of it. Right? It changed our whole way of perception, all our presupposition, our assumptions about the issue. What I want to offer you now is an analytical framework. What you will see now are ways to filter and understand what you're seeing on TV. Why are the Israelis so adamant about this war? Why are we refusing a ceasefire? Why is a ceasefire not good for the goals of the war? Why are Israelis rejecting the two-state solution? What's going on here? All right? So it's very important to understand this. First of all, the realization that we're not fighting for borders. Remember, they attacked existing borders. They attacked legitimate borders, internationally recognized borders. They attacked towns and villages that were on their ground legitimately for 75 years. Yet still the world turned against us and doesn't justify our defensive war. And Israelis are realizing we're not fighting for borders anymore. We're not fighting the post-67 land for peace paradigm. We're fighting for the existence of Israel from 1948. You see, if Hamas can do this and get away with it, they can do it again. And again. And again. And again. And again, and again, and again, and again. Not me saying this, they are saying this. This is their words. Their leaders are saying this. They will do it again and again and again and again and again, which means that Israelis won't be able to live there. That's the end of Israel. It's not just on the southern border by Gaza. It's also on the northern border by Lebanon, where Hezbollah has a whole army ready to do the same thing. And I'm going to tell you something else. If they're able to get away with it, you will see more October 7th, not only in Israel. You'll see October 7th in London and in Paris and right here in the United States of America. Because the thing that gives terrorism the most encouragement is terrorism. Again, a false paradigm, a false assumption in the West that terrorism occurs because there's no hope. People turn to terrorism when they have no other choice. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. Remember the choices they had back in 2005. Remember the choice they had in 2011, in 2008, in 2000, in 67, in 47, in 36. There are lots of choices. The men that flew into the Twin Towers were not poor, impoverished. Right? They were wealthy. They were educated men. They made a choice to fly into those towers. And they're making this choice now too. Successful terrorism breeds more terrorism. Israel must win this war because the ramifications, if are not for Israel only. They're for the rest of the world. And the second paradigm shift for Israelis is that there's no viable option for peaceful coexistence with a Palestinian body politic that wishes to live side by side with Israel in peace. We want that to be true. We wish that to be true, that there is a large enough body politic or population on the Palestinian side that want to live side by side in peace with Israel. That's what the world leaders are saying. That's what your president is saying. That's what the State Department has been saying for 100 years. There's no data to support this statement. Actually, the data is quite the opposite. This is Khalil Shkaki's numbers. He is a Palestinian pollster. He's the most well-known, recognized, and legitimate pollster. The support for Hamas was not only in the majority in October 6th, it actually increased in October 7th. Popularity for Hamas increased October 7th, after knowing what they've done. Palestinian Authority has not condemned Hamas yet for doing this. These are the people, remember the corrupt people that Jimmy Carter talked about in 2006? That now many people around the world want to bring back to Gaza to rule the day after Hamas. And so Israelis no longer believe that there's a possibility right now, under these constraints, for a viable two-state solution. Not because we don't want peace. Most Israelis would happily give up territory if it can provide them with peace. That's the paradigm, remember, Land for Peace. But if those countries, last week, Ireland, Spain, and Norway, recognize the Palestinian state, which is completely nonsensical because it doesn't exist. But if a Palestinian state is born today, it will be a Palestinian state of rapists and murderers. That's the kind of state you wish for the Palestinians? If you're pro-Palestinian, you need to stand up against this. The second level of analysis is the regional one. And now it's clear that the Iranians have been building for decades a ring, or we call it a ring of fire around Israel. You hear in the news often the term proxies, an Iranian proxy. The Houthis are an Iranian proxy. The Hezbollah, these are Iranian proxies. What does it look like? Now you see. For 40 years, Iran has been building a ring of fire around Israel, employing Shiite militias, going into countries that are already unstable, destabilizing them further, putting a military force which is always stronger than the existing national military. Now, do you know a sovereign country that has a military that's not the strongest military force in that country? Can you imagine? Well, that's what these countries are. Yet they're still considered sovereign countries. They still have a vote in the UN. Iran controls 5 countries, 5 votes in the UN. Right? Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. And they've surrounded Israel, not because they care about Israel or the Palestinians, they actually don't. They will fight until the last drop of Palestinian blood or last drop of Lebanese blood in order to destroy Israel. Why? Because Israel's in the way. Israel's not the main course. Israel's only the little devil. What's the main course? You are. The Iranians believe that they are able to destroy Israel. Not only will they remove a stumbling block on their way west, but they will galvanize and bring the entire Muslim and Arab world behind them to have the legitimacy to continue their revolution and export it to the West. This is their stated goal. They stand up in the parliament in Tehran twice a week, shout, "Death to Israel, death to America." Believe them. Give them at the least the respect of taking them at their word. This is what it looked like on April 13th when they attacked Israel with 300 missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. 300, there's unprecedented attack. No country in the world had to absorb this kind of attack. They intended to kill hundreds and thousands of Israelis. By the way, this would have killed Arabs as well, Muslims and Christians, not just Jews. When 300 ballistic missiles and drones and cruise missiles are fired indiscriminately into civilian populations. Miraculously, and I don't mean that, I mean that literally. Miraculously, Israel knocked down 99% of these incoming rockets. With the help of the United States of America, armed forces, with the help of the Brits and the French, even other Arab countries, were able to knock 99% of these rockets out of the sky. So much so that Israel's success was then held up against it. The world told Israel not to retaliate. This is the worst attack on a sovereign nation in history, in modern history. Israel was not supposed to respond. Nor harm nor foul, right? Nothing happened. Don't respond. The world is watching. The world is watching. And that's the third level of analysis. Everything you see on TV, everything you see reported from the war, everything you see about Ukraine, about China, about Taiwan, must be placed in the new chessboard, the global chessboard which is happening in front of our eyes. We've moved almost without noticing from a post-war world, a Cold War we thought we won, to a new pre-war world. And I know this is difficult to hear, and I'm sorry, but we're already in it. You're already in it. What Israel is to Iran, Ukraine is to Russia, and Taiwan is to China. Philippines, South China Sea, Japan is to North Korea. I put a question mark here. I'm not sure about that last one. But what we're looking at is an alignment of these state actors, belligerent to their neighbors, that have Western or strong ties to Western or American interests. They all have different reasons, they all have different agendas, they all have different ideologies, but they all share one thing in common. The West, and America at its head, is in their way. And the question is not Gaza or Israel. And we can talk about Gaza and Israel until we're blue in the face, and we'll learn really a lot about the tree, but we'll be missing the forest. Because the question is not what Israel will do in Rafah. By the way, this morning, dozens of rockets were fired from Rafah to Tel Aviv. The same place the world has been telling Israel not to go into, don't go into Rafah. The question is not Rafah. The question is, what is the world that we're leaving our children, and what is the world that our grandchildren will grow up in? Is it the world where the despots, the dictators, and the tyrants are setting the tone? The countries that support jihad and slavery and subjugate women and violate human rights and oppress religious and ethnic minorities and promote chaos wherever they go, belligerent to their neighbors and their own people? Or is it the world where, as flawed as they are, as we are, because we're all people and we're flawed, it's Western democracies and moderate Arab countries that truly uphold human rights, that truly support freedoms and liberties, that truly support equality and protection of religious and ethnic minorities, that promote coexistence and success and thriving communities. That's the question. That's the world which is shaping up. That's the big conflict that is shaping up in front of us. It's Huntington's Class of Civilizations, if those of you are familiar with this term. Back in 1992, there was a very famous article that was published by a gentleman by the name of Francis Fukuyama. It was called The End of History. And in it, he said, liberal democracies won. Woo! We won. It's the end of history. No more wars, no more big conflicts. We're done. The political evolution of humankind had reached its apex. And all the world will now flow to the globalized reality and want to be just like the West. And we all went to focus on our iPhones and jeans and developing startups and social media, et cetera, but they didn't. And so they started going to universities and buying up property and introducing new professors and new faculties and teaching your children, our children, generations of students about the oppressor-oppressed paradigm. They fed on top of the neo-Marxist ideas that came out of the 60s and 70s to divide the world between powerful and powerless. And the whole world is now viewed through this prism. And within that prism, Israel represents all the horrible things that the West has ever done. Colonialism, oppression, genocide, which is the reason for the explosion of anti-Semitism. And that's the final level of analysis of what's happening around you today. The veneer of civility has been washed away. The distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is no longer. People said, oh, I'm not anti-Jewish. Right? I'll just open parentheses. When we say anti-Semitism, we mean anti-Jewish. Anti-Semitism is a word that was invented in Austria in the beginning of the 20th century to whitewash the hatred of Jews. It's part of the racial theory that divides people into races with different qualities. It's all junk science. It's based on social Darwinism. And within that, the Jews are not the lowest race, they're the subhuman species. The virus of humanity, just like a virus in the biological world, the Jews consider the virus of the social world, which is why it must be eradicated. This is the belief in the original racial theory developed by the Austrians and the Germans and then adopted by the Nazis. All right? And a lot of people said, I'm not anti-Jewish, and they used the word anti-Semite to whitewash the fact that it's anti-Jewish. And people say, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm only anti-Zionist. I'm not against Jews. I'm against oppression. I'm against white supremacy. I'm against colonialism. Well, that mask is now completely off. Anti-Semitism is defined as a mutating virus. It always changes in every generation, in every society, in every continent where it exists. And it is always the same. It is the opposite of whatever society holds dear. Whatever is your highest value, the Jew will be the opposite. For the anti-Semite. For the anti-Semite, whatever they hate most will be pinned on the Jews. And this is true from the moment the Jews show up on the stage of history. It's in our book. When the children of Israel received the word of the God of Israel and are chosen as the vessel to bring the knowledge of Yahweh into the world, they come to the pagan world around them and tell them, your gods are false. They're weak. Only one God exists, and he's the only one that we serve. My God is stronger than yours. Na, 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 na. Pretty much. And they don't like that. You know who doesn't like to hear that they're morally corrupt? The morally corrupt. And so from the moment the Jews show up on the stage of history, they present themselves as the civilizational other. They're always the other. So they rejected the pagan world. It took them hundreds of years, by the way. They too were, like Elijah says, stepping on both sides, remember? They too were worshiping Asherah and Baal. They too were worshiping on the high places where they weren't supposed to. It took them a while. Every time they got, clobbered over their head. And every time they said, oh, God, I'm so sorry. I need to repent, I need to repent, I need to repent. Until God had enough and he had the temple destroyed, Jerusalem exiled by the waters of Babylon, when we sat and wept and we remembered Zion. For the wicked carried us away into captivity, requiring of us a song. But how could we sing the Lord's song in the strange land? And later on, we forget the O Jerusalem, am I right? Hadluzins cunning, the yearning to return, but now the understanding that there is one God, our God, the powerful God, the only God. And they're still hated for it. Because now they reject Hellenism, the new global religion, the new global culture. And then they reject the Roman world. The Romans thought the Jews were lazy and immoral for rejecting Roman values and not participating in Roman rites and resting a day a week. Who does that? Lazy people. You like your weekend? Yeah? You're welcome. And then they reject Christianity. The early church needed to find a solution to the rejection of the Jews of Jesus as the Messiah. And so Jews were vilified. Jews were rejected. Jews were marginalized. Jews were hated. Jews became the spawn of Satan. They were vilified as the Antichrist. In order to prove the ascendancy of the church, this is replacement theology. In the early days of the church, they must have skipped that part that says you're being grafted in to the root of David. And Paul's teachings about not changing a word from the Mosaic law. And the fact that we are worshiping the same God and have the same goals and the same foundational values. But in those days, the vilification of Jews was the word of the day. That led to the accusation of the Jew as the Antichrist, as the performing host desecration, deicide, responsible for killing God. The blood libel, murdering Christian children and using their blood for Passover. Very popular idea in Europe, their artwork until this very day. This idea was copy-pasted into the Muslim world as well. This idea is that led straight to Auschwitz. But when religion is no longer the ruling ideals, and Europe turns to nation states, the Jew is now the usurper, the traitor, the fifth column, the Judas. In the communist world, the Jew is the capitalist. In the capitalist world, the Jew is the communist. The Jew is either too rich or too poor. The Jew is either isolationist or infiltrates our ranks. In a world of racial purity, the Jew is the ultimate impurity. And now, in a world where colonialism, apartheid, genocide are the worst crimes against humanity, the Jew is blamed of that too. Oh, sorry, not the Jew, the Jewish state. But the Jews are identified with the Jewish state because the majority of Jews will define themselves as Zionists. But for the last 50 years, they've kidnapped, they've hijacked the word Zionist. 1975, the Soviets pushed forward a resolution in the UN to identify Zionism with racism. It was rescinded later on, but the damage was done. For decades, in liberal arts colleges, in political science classes, in Middle East studies classes, all funded by the Qataris, in the gender classes, Zionism was labeled, again, hijacked away from the Zionists, away from the Jews, and relabeled, rebranded as racist, as colonial, as supremacist. Okay? And you get to this. So I was very glad to hear, Pastor told me that when October 7th happened, you reached out to your Jewish friends and to the other Jewish congregation here, and that warmed my heart, truly. It really did. Your Jewish neighbors and your colleagues are hurting. They're hurting really, really badly. And they need to hear from you. But I want you to remember us also. What starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. The reason that a society thrives is because a society allows for truth and a free exchange of ideas. In a society like that, Jews can live freely. When Jews have to hide their Judaism, that's when a society is starting to hide the truth. The big three, as I mentioned just before, again, I don't want to get into too deeply, but these are lies. These are lies that they started to accuse Israel already on October 8th. Israel hasn't even begun the counteroffensive, but they're already shouting genocide, how Israel's destroying Gaza. And they repeated it again and again and again and again. Again, not a single Israeli soldier has entered Gaza. It's straight out of the playbook of Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister. Make the lie big, he said. Make the lie as big as you can and repeat it over and over and over and over and over. People have a tendency not to believe small lies because we all lie. A little bit. White lies. But big lies? No. So they believe it. And they believe it. They're believing it. People around the world who believe this. The numbers don't add up. There's no numbers to suggest this is genocide. We know what genocide looks like. The Jewish genocide in Europe. We have the Rwanda, Cambodian. You can look at the Armenian. You can look at many genocides around the world, even right now. And you can see that dip in population size. Palestinian population has only grown since the establishment of the State of Israel. If we are doing genocide, we suck at it. We're really horrible at it. Right? Israel could have done a genocide if it wanted to. Israel's able to do it, but it doesn't. Hamas and Iran want to do it, but they can't. That's the difference. It's also not ethnic cleansing. This is what ethnic cleansing really looks like. This is the number of Jews in Arab countries that were ethnically cleansed between the mid-40s and the mid-50s. Close to 900,000 Jews that lived in Morocco and Algeria and Libya and Egypt and Iraq and Yemen and Syria and Lebanon, all gone. All gone. That's what ethnic cleansing looked like. Israel is doing neither. What Israel doing? Israel is doing? Israel's prosecuting a war. A terrible war. A horrible war. There's not a war like this in the history of wars. There's nothing to compare it to. Nowhere did you ever find a terror group, an army, embedding itself within and underneath civilian population and infrastructure. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And even if we accept the numbers that Hamas, Ministry of Health, are putting out, and there's no reason to accept it, by the way, because they lie about the numbers. But let's accept it. Let's go with the number 35,000. Israel says that it killed up to 15,000 terrorists. Hamas don't distinguish in their numbers between the men and the women, or they don't count, or they don't include they include the men within this total number of 35, but they label them as civilians. If you take down the number of people who died of natural causes over the last 8 months, and people who died at the hands of Hamas, either deliberately or accidentally from rockets that fell short, you're getting to roughly 15,000 civilians who were killed from Israeli strikes. And that's terrible. It's tragic. And I ask you also to include those deaths of civilians, of children, in your prayers. Because war is horrible. If you compare the ratio of combatant to non-combatant in this war, you get to 1-to-1. If there are 15,000 civilians and there are 15,000 terrorists, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. Do you know what the global ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in global urban warfare? It's 1-to-9. 1 combatant to 9 civilians. That's the global ratio. The Americans and the British did a little bit better in Iraq and Afghanistan, 1-to-5 and 1-to-4. Israel is managing somehow 1-to-1. Not only is it not genocide, it's not indiscriminate bombing, it's not purposeful directly targeting of civilians, it's the opposite. Israel has managed to reach a level of care and a level of protecting of civilian population in war higher than any other country in any other war. Again, every single casualty is tragic. It's terrible, and we must pray for them. It's war. It must end. It's not genocide. Every single blood, every single drop of blood from my perspective, is on the hands of Hamas. The apartheid colonialism, also very easy to refute. You need to be in Israel, 5 minutes on an Israeli street to see that Israel has a multiplicity of ethnicities, that Israelis are not white, that they have all different color and skin tones. 2 million Muslim Arabs live in Israel as free, independent, full rights citizens, vote and are elected to parliament, serve in the military army, on the Supreme Court, hospitals, lawyers, doctors, healthcare workers, bankers, teachers, drivers, business owners, you name it. There's discrimination, to be sure. I'm not going to pretend that we're not immune to these human faults. Apartheid? Not really. There are more Muslims in Israel living a free, independent life than there are Jews in Europe. Just to give a bit of a comparison. And out of the 300 million Arabs living in the Middle East, there are only 2 million who have all the rights and freedoms that Westerners enjoy. And all of them live in Israel. So, we want to talk about discrimination? Sure. Apartheid? Absolutely not. I don't need to tell you about colonialism either. Pastor's words before I came on the stage say it all. If you distill the Old Testament into a few sentences, just narrow it down. The Abrahamic covenant. God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. The covenant of God of Israel, children of Israel, and the land of Israel. To claim that the children of Israel are somehow colonizing the land of Israel as foreigners is so preposterous. I think there are some ideas that are so preposterous only intellectuals could have thought about them. The war of misinformation is the last point I want to share. But I don't want to get into too many details. This is basically the news that you read in the mainstream media is not news. It is a version of the events that usually project the opposite of what actually happened. And I have several examples here. This is a case from a couple months ago where Palestinian gunmen opened up fire on the Gazans waiting for humanitarian aid, killed 29 Gazans from Hamas direct fire, and they blamed Israel. A day later, there's a video over there that actually shows this. Israel actually released that video of showing the Hamas gunmen shooting, right? But on the 15th, on the same day, even though the information was all there, it was all reported as though Israel has done the killing. This is the same report from Reuters and AP, same guy from Egypt. In one, he says 29, and the other, it says 6. How do you get from one to that? I don't know, but nobody bothers to check. Because there's no real journalists in Gaza. They're only Hamas activists. And the mainstream media just takes their information and then sends it to you as though it's legitimate information. I found one publication in Toronto that started with the Israeli denial. Whatever doesn't fit the paradigm doesn't make the cut. So what you're viewing, and know this, when you see a mainstream media story, it must fit the paradigm. David and Goliath in reverse. Israel is now the Goliath. The Palestinian is now the David. What a great journalistic story. Israel, oppressor, occupier, bad. Palestinian, poor, underdog, occupied, victim. That's the paradigm. If the story doesn't fit that paradigm, you won't see it. Or the story will be written in a way to fit that paradigm. So that's what happened. And then it was reported, no, it was, well, we did this already, sorry. And then it was reported, this is as though 4 Israelis and 2 Palestinians were killed. Some random person killed 4 and 2, as though everybody's a victim. Or worse, it's the Israeli police who shot 2 Palestinians after an attack. And it happens often, over and over and over again. It's not something that's new. You'll see this all the time. Terror attack becomes in brackets. Israel claims Israeli planes pound Gaza, and then on the 4th paragraph down, you'll see why, and so on and so forth. I'm going to end my presentation here. Before I do, I want to share with you my favorite quote from Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke said, "When bad men combine, the good must associate. Else will fall, one by one, a pitiful sacrifice and a contemptible struggle." Well, the bad men have combined, and now it's time for the good to associate. Thank you very much.
We want to take some time just for some questions.
Sure.
Guys, if you can help out with the stools. And do you have your mic? That's great.
Want to take these chairs from back here, or
You guys are going to come up. Do you have any questions to start off?
Yeah, I do have a couple questions. Let's just start off with this. When I was with you, we were outside of Gaza in a kibbutz, and thank you, young man. And the thing I noticed, first of all, was, they all had, how many of you, by the way, have ever gone to your basement in a tornado? Any of you? Okay. So instead of basements for tornadoes, they have bomb shelters for bombs. And we were there, and it really struck me when I was there with you, with Ray, with Dave DeShaw, who's watching right now, by the way, so wave to Dave.
Dave.
There were bomb shelters at the playgrounds. There were bicycles and toys leaning up against the bomb shelters. But you mentioned this morning in our church that those bomb shelters were designed for one thing, but they didn't have locks on the doors and so forth. Can you share that with
Sure.
the folks here tonight?
So I was asked this morning to tell a little bit about what happened there, and some personal personal friends of mine that were there on the morning of October 7th. First of all, kibbutz is a communal farm. Most of the people who live on kibbutz aren't farmers, but they own the farm together. They work off the kibbutz in different places, but it's a very close-knit community. Everybody knows everyone. Kids sleep over other houses. Dogs and children walk freely on the lawn. So it's a very, very close-knit community. It's like a large family. And on the morning of October 7th, it was the morning of the holiday. It was the last day of the holiday of Sukkot. It was Simchat Torah, when Jews celebrate the completion of the cycle of reading the Torah. And everybody was home, still celebrating, sleeping in, ready to a beautiful autumn, or was just late summer day. And that's when the attack started. And right away, because they're used to sirens. I mean, that's what they have there. When you hear a siren in that area, you have 15 seconds to reach a shelter. 15 seconds to reach a shelter. And that's life. It's been life like that for 20 years, since 2007 when Hamas took over. Imagine if you're driving, you got two little children in your car, and both in car seats. And now the siren goes off, and you have 15 seconds. Which one of them do you take? It's a very difficult life, but they managed it. They were resilient, and they managed it, and they thrived. And the bomb shelters were designed so people can run away, get shelter, and 10 minutes later, everything clears, they continue. But they were designed for incoming bombs. They weren't designed for people in the living room. So none of the doors have locks. They just don't have locks. It's a design flaw. Nobody thought about it. No one thought that would be even a possibility. And so they all went into the safe rooms. They closed the door so shrapnel or a direct hit even won't enter. But then they heard the terrorist outside their door. And so for hours, they had to hold a handle. For hours, in some cases even a whole day, until the army was able to show up. They're holding the handle while there's a terrorist on the other side. And in some cases, they weren't able to hold the handle as long as they needed to. And the terrorist made it through or shot through the door. And in the cases that they couldn't, they just burned the house down. Wow. And so a colleague of mine, his name is Aviv Kuntz, his whole family of 3 children, family of 5, were burnt alive. And they found them hugging, but just a big piece of charcoal together. They found little children. Like they found a piece of charcoal that only in the X-ray they saw the spines that there was actually 2 human forms. They found charred bodies of parents and children bound together. A friend of mine, a friend of ours, you know her also. She was our host when we were in Kfar Aza, one of the kibbutz communities there, was abroad, and she was actually with her phone communicating between the army and the civilians, because the army communication completely broke down. Hamas were able to destroy our army communication, and the army was blind. And so it's only the civilian communication network that was being used, and somebody had to convey that information to the army on their civilian network. And she was acting from Portugal. She was doing this, situation room, and her sister was locked up with her brother, with her father and other children that came to sleep over for 12 hours. And they were holding the door while they're holding the handle, while there are terrorists surrounding their house trying to get in for 12 hours, until the army finally showed up to rescue them. And during those 12 hours, she tells of her sister that she actually contemplated not letting her children fall to the hands of Hamas alive. Now, you've been to Masada. Right? The story of Masada is a story of a last stand of the last Jewish rebels against Rome that ended up with a mass suicide or a mass murder-suicide, depending on how you tell the story. And I always tell the story that we can't imagine what it was like, what it might have been like to even contemplate killing your own children so they don't fall to the horrors that would be done to them by the Romans. And I always said, that can't happen. We can't really understand what that means. Well, turns out that we can.
Wow.
And if I can, and I was there in Masada with Uri when he made that statement. And I think just the one thing I want to point out, Pastor, if I can, is that it's one thing when we see these headlines on the news, but we feel so distant, it's like, oh, that's too bad. Oh, that's too bad. Oh, shame. But having Uri here, you understand that this is not just a headline. This is personal.
Yeah.
These are real people. He's describing some people that I met, that I saw, that I had fellowship with, and people that he knows very personally. So keep that in mind when you pray for the peace of Israel, Pastor.
Amen. Amen. Well, actually, I didn't get to go to Masada.
Okay.
Our trip was so jam-packed, and so I was thinking of another location, but I look forward to someday being able to
August
see
would have
that.
been too hot. That's
Yes.
why I guess that was part of it.
There's a lot of hot places in Israel. The top of Mount Arbel was the hottest. I think we were at a 127 heat index.
Wow.
It was just sweltering.
When you come, we'll make sure it's not on the hottest month of the year.
Yes.
Turn on the air conditioning.
We'll get to a question in just a minute, but you mentioned there was so much that I learned hearing you speak, and very, very helpful. When we went, we really were there to combat, as pastors, to combat the rise of replacement theology here in the States. And so church, what he referred to a moment ago as between the Jews and Christianity and replacement theology is that the church is the replacement of Israel, and all the promises that were towards Israel are now towards the church. And replacement theology is a very damaging heresy that causes a lot of problems, and it results in a hatred towards the Jews. And so that is something that we as a church do not align with. We don't believe, and as you aptly mentioned Paul, I was writing down there, Paul in Romans 11 deals with that. Hold on. You remember and you appreciate. And the gospel was to go to the Jew first and also to the Greek, but the idea of this replacement is something that we do not see in Scripture. And we don't align with people that see that. And so I just wanted to draw that distinction. The early church, I don't believe that was a part of the early church, from Paul's viewpoint, from Peter's viewpoint.
Right.
It wasn't a part of the early church doctrine. It came later on.
That's right.
Came really in 400, the area of 400 with
That's
the
right.
Catholic Church. But as a Baptist church, we are not Protestant. We never were in the Catholic Church to have to protest and come out of the Catholic Church. We have always believed the principles and the teachings of the New Testament. And so that's a big difference. Many, even Baptists, will be confused and sometimes reference themselves as Protestant. We are not Protestant. We never came out of the Catholic Church. We've always believed the New Testament teachings. Go ahead.
Thank you, Pastor. And Uri and I have had so many wonderful conversations, but there are different types of Judaism. They're not all the same. We might call it denominationalism, but for us who are not necessarily educated in that field or in that category, we tend to think of Jews as all being the same. But Uri, would you talk to that? And then also the fact that in Judaism, many times they just look at us and say, if you have a cross, then you're a Christian.
Yep.
And they don't discern necessarily between our Catholic friends or our Pentecostal friends or our Baptist friends or the different branches of Christianity across the world.
Okay. What's the question?
So the question is
Jewish perspective.
Okay.
Jewish perspective.
So the Jewish perspective and how Jews, when we talk about Christianity, and because there were some things historically that certain Christians didn't do that were towards the Jewish people, but the Jewish people tend to blend that all with Christianity.
So I'll start with the beginning, because there are several denominations of Jews, especially here in the United States. You'll know them as Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. Under these categories, the conservatives are the more liberal ones, and the Reform are even further on the progressive side. But these are American divisions. They don't really exist in Israel. I mean, they do exist. There are conservative and Reform communities in Israel, but they're very, very marginal. In Israel, it will be secular and religious, and the synagogue the secular Israelis, Jewish Israelis don't go to is Orthodox, right? If that makes sense, right? So when they do require religious services, they will go to the Orthodox establishment and not to the Reform or Conservative, even though they do exist there. They're not, the distance between Jewish denominations is still close enough that we all are under the same tent. So Jews will consider other denominations as part of the same family, which is how I would also suggest looking at Judaism in general, not as a religion, but as a family, as a tribe, as a national identity, even culture or even civilization that includes religion. The religious expression of Judaism is through the Jewish faith. But there are many Jews who are not religious, even atheists, but they still have a place of honor inside the tent. Right? So it's a different way of looking at Judaism. It's not just a religion, and you can't put it in the same category as Catholics, Protestants, Baptists, or Muslims. Okay? It's not the same. As far as the Jewish view, look, Jews don't have, say that Jews don't have a history, we have a memory. And our collective memory over the last 2,000 years and where we rubbed up against Christianity is in Europe, not here in America. That's where the friction took place. That's where replacement theology was born. The Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, that led later on again to the persecution and the vilification and the subjugation and the marginalization, the Inquisition. A lot of shins going on here. The Inquisition, right, and the persecution of Jews, and that experience is what branded the church for the Jewish people. And so there is little effort, because of this memory, there's little effort to learn about or to distinguish between different Christian denominations. And so Jews, although today in modern time, especially in America, because we know that we have strong friendships among Christians, we have strong communication, we have shared values. There's a lot of, as like you said, when you stand up and say, I reject or I'm not aligned with replacement theology, that is a very big, meaningful statement for Jews who are used to thinking about Christians as though the only reason they like us is because they want us to become Christian, and if not, then the end of days will come and they'll take care of that. Right? And again, I know that's a very narrow, very shallow interpretation, but for 2,000 years, that has been the experience of Jews. And so there is a suspicion which exists there, which we are still just 1-2 generations removed from the Holocaust. Yeah. And so the suspicion is still there, and I think it will take a few more years. So, and I see that, by the way, as one of my roles, one of my callings, because of my work, because of my close affiliation with and my friendship with many Christians and churches and pastors, to try to bring that bridge back together. The days of the early days, first century, second century, when the Christians were persecuted even more than the Jews by the Romans. The Christians, I don't know if you know this, but Christians, people identified as Christians, were persecuted even more than Jewish people were at the hands of the Romans. The place where Christians went to find refuge is in synagogues. The scrolls that they read, the text that they read were in synagogues. Jews and Christians were they were like Jewish denominations today, part of the same family. I want to get back to that. It's only later on when the leadership, like you said, in the Catholic and the Roman Empire in the 4th century, late 4th century, early 5th century, began to separate between Jews and Christians, that it started to become a problem. Yeah. But from that perspective, I would like to go back to the fundamentals.
I appreciate the clarity and the understanding that you brought there. That's helpful. Let's take a few questions. I know we've really enjoyed all the time here, so let's start over here. Mr. Ben.
In our news, I think what we see is our news media depicts Benjamin Netanyahu as being the bad guy for the majority of the Israeli people. How can that be?
Netanyahu is the elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And if he will be replaced as the Prime Minister, it is a decision that the Israeli citizens and only the Israeli citizens can make. And so I reject any attempt to force Netanyahu out of his role as Prime Minister. I may agree or disagree with him. That's not the point. The point is that Israel is a democracy. And so the calls, when people are calling for the replacement of Netanyahu, a democratically elected leader of a democratic ally, but not, for example, for the regime replacement of Iran. In fact, in the UN, they stand up for a moment of silence for the president of Iran's death. That is what I call a moral inversion, which the world is suffering from, a broken moral compass. Now, as far as Netanyahu himself, they will be an account. He will have to stand up and give explanations to the people of Israel for his role in the calamity that befell Israel on October 7th. It is his statecraft over the last 15 years as Prime Minister that brought us to this place. And he will have to stand to account and give explanations to the people of Israel. I will argue that right now, even without Netanyahu in place, let's say he had resigned on October 8th or whatever reason, the war would have been prosecuted in the exact same way. In fact, the majority of Israelis are disappointed that Netanyahu has been holding back from going into Rafah 3 months ago, for example. Right? There is a consensus in Israel that the war must be fought and must be won. And it's got nothing to do with Netanyahu. The attempt to make him the bad guy and vilify Netanyahu is simply an attempt to strongman this argument that Israel has fallen to the hand of extremists and make a moral equivalency between Netanyahu and the terrorist leaders that are hiding in the Hamas tunnels. I find it repugnant, and I reject it wholeheartedly.
Okay, Saul, a question over here. Go ahead.
Yes, my question is what happened on October 7th. I believe that whatever happened in this kibbutz it's closer to the Palestinian people. That's why the Hamas were able to walk. Just there was no border, there were no fences, and that's why they were able to walk and attack these people who are celebrating some music or festival. And then the find that the people were able to run down and hold onto the doors for 12 hours. My question is, I thought Israel has a very good intelligence, the Mossad. Why could they not be able to have picked up this? And why did it take 12 hours for the army to arrive?
That's a great question that Israelis are asking as well. One correction, there is actually a very, very elaborate, sophisticated fence and barrier between the Gaza Strip and the kibbutz communities around the Gaza Strip. It is actually one of the strongest fences and defense lines in the world, both overground and underground. And Hamas was able to nullify it in 1 hour. They breached it in more than 20 places along the fence. They managed to take tactics that they learned from the Russians in Ukraine to drop from drones bombs on our eyes and our ears along the fence. They managed to cut out our communications, to turn the army blind. They had intelligence. They knew exactly where everybody was. They knew in every single one of the kibbutz communities who is the head of the internal security, of the civil guard of that kibbutz. They knew where the armories were. Israel allowed Gazan workers to come into Israel to work. The belief was, the assumption was that if we allow them to come to work and to have a better economy, that will raise the standard of living in Gaza and de-incentivize terrorists. Remember the false assumption that the lack of hope, that the hopelessness is what drives people to terrorism? So we thought with a better economy, less terrorism. That was the idea. Turns out that some of those people that came into Israel to work were spying for Hamas. And they knew exactly, the people who were giving them work, the people who were sustaining their families, they wrote down their names. Hamas knew exactly who lived in which house, and who's the head, and who has the keys to the armory. So they set up ambush at the armory. So when the kibbutzniks came to the armory to pick up their guns to run and defend, they picked them off one by one. So they had intelligence, and they had capabilities that we did not expect. They also had massive numbers we did not expect. The scenarios that Israel expected were, one unit or 3, 5, 7 terrorists crossing a fence once. They came with 3,000, heavily armed in vehicles with bombs and TNT and RPGs and hand grenades and incendiary devices. And then 1,500 civilians came in their wake. That's 4,500 people that flooded those kibbutz communities, murdering and pillaging and raping and slaughtering and dismembering. There was, even if Israel had the expectation of this attack, we wouldn't have the numbers to stop it. As to the second part of your question, you're absolutely right. Israel has one of the best intelligence units in the world. But any intelligence unit is still governed by assumptions and presuppositions. The intelligence gathers tries to identify two pieces of information. What is the capability of the enemy, and what is the intent of the enemy? In some cases, we knew they have the intent. They talk about it. I showed you the charter. We didn't think they had the capability or the motivation. We thought the Hamas is just happy to sit down and get fat on the money that the Qataris send them and that they take from Israeli taxes, and don't have the will or the willingness to go to another round with Israel that might end their reign in Gaza. That is the perception. That was the statecraft that I was talking about. And that was wrong. But that statecraft is what governed the intelligence outcome. And all those people will have to stand to account. But we still don't know exactly what happened on that day.
There's a lot more investigation yet to happen once there's a little bit more time.
It's true.
Brain space. Let's take another question, and then we're going to bring this to a close. I know, Uri, you had a slide where questions could be asked.
Yes.
Okay. Is that
So you have my email on one of the slides over there, and my social. That QR code is for if to supporting my journey and supporting my work and my ministry. If you want to, that's not there's no obligation. But if you want to ask more questions, or you feel free to contact me. Yes.
Because I'm sure there's a lot of questions yet that we could ask tonight. Go ahead.
Just one thing, he talked about the Hamas charter, and it was centralized on Israel, is that correct?
On the Jews,
On the Jews.
not just Israel.
Is America in that charter?
So America is the charter because it's not specifically named, or it's named as one of the countries that Jews control, as though the Jews also run America. But the idea of global jihad and a global caliphate includes the tearing down of America. I would also say, I would add, since Dave's watching, I'm going to add this. The whole motivation, or the reason the Iranians pulled the trigger now, has to do with the fact that the Saudis were about to enter the Abraham Accords. Right? So the previous administration, President Trump was able to push forward and create the Abraham Accords, bringing the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, even Sudan into the Abrahamic Accords with Israel, meaning that no longer land for peace, but now it's peace for peace. Right? The idea that we're all part of the Abrahamic family and we all belong. And that is something that the Americans were pushing. It was a matter of weeks before the Saudis would have joined. And if the Saudis would have joined, that would have swung the whole pendulum of the Middle East and other Arab and Muslim countries towards Israel and towards the United States. That would have created huge prestige in the eyes of the world for the United States. And that is something that the Iranians have been working for 4 decades to undo. But if the Saudis had come join the Abraham Accords, that would have nullified the Iranian efforts. And so they pulled the trigger, because they believed that this kind of attack, that would have been the Gazans, Hezbollah in the north, Arabs in Israel, Arabs in the West Bank, the whole Muslim world would have joined in, and that would have completely pulled the rug under the United States and the Saudis in the Abraham Accords. So pushing or bringing down the U.S. is definitely on the agenda of these people.
Learn lots tonight? Okay. This is a lot. Y'all are really hungry tonight.
Why don't we
That's
take
great.
both of them together, and I'll answer them together,
All
or
right.
one after the other.
Mine's really quick. You mentioned like the 25 to 30% number. Is that specifically like jihadist extremists?
So, yeah.
Okay.
So these are polls that are done across the Muslim and Arab world, and they have a series of questions of, do you believe that? Things like that, and that's how they categorize it.
And is that roughly the density that you would see in Gaza, or does Gaza by chance have like a higher proportion?
Higher. Gaza, it's higher. It's at least 50% that are actually part and parcel of Hamas, and then they have also higher numbers after. But there's more support for Hamas in the West Bank than there is in Gaza, which is also very interesting. Yes,
Judy.
ma'am.
One
No, because we don't speak English. So in Hebrew, they don't call them Christians. They call you Notzrim, Nazarethians, from Nazareth. Jesus from Nazareth. So the word in Hebrew is Notzri. Okay, Natsrut. Christianity is Natsrut from the word Nazareth. So the simple answer is no.
Another question is, the news outlet, is there anything that's reliable that we can watch?
Yes. I recommend in the mainstream media from Israel, Times of Israel. It's a publication in English, online publication. Times of Israel, very reliable, very honest. It even has a 20-minute daily podcast that you can listen to on the way to work, just to get quick updates and hear what's going on. Just one example, this whole ICJ decision just a couple of days ago, which the whole world and the media reported as though the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, called Israel to stop the war in Rafah. So they just very simply broke it down and showed how they all reported wrong on this decision. All right, so Times of Israel is a great resource. Jerusalem Post, also in English, is a very good resource. And I recommend also, if you're on Telegram or X, to look at Abu Ali Express in English. I know, long story. Another resource is a gentleman by the name of Amir Tsarfati. Amir Tsarfati brings great information, but he's also a Messianic Jew. So he also has an angle of prophecy and Christian relevant information that you might find interesting.
Perhaps I could get some of those written down
Sure,
on the list
absolutely.
a little bit later on and give those on to everyone. Also, All Israel News with Joel Rosenberg. He does All Israel News and All Arab News, and so those are sites that potentially that you could look at as well. Did you have one more?
One more, yes. Why don't the congressmen that are in Congress say something pro-Israel? I'm thinking of Chuck Schumer. I know there are others, but he's the only one that comes to mind. Why doesn't he speak up pro-Israel instead of silence?
I think that's a question for Chuck Schumer to answer. I think that in general, he's a politician, as a member of his own party, and there are a lot of internal politics now in the Democratic Party that are governing some of the decision-making regarding this war in Israel. I hope and pray that will change, and let's leave it at that.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank
for
you.
taking
Thank
your
you very
time.
much for, wow, it's almost 8:30. Thank you very much for your patience and time.
As you were speaking, and I referenced it, but in you hearing all this death and mayhem, I'm just reminded that there is an enemy. Jesus said in John 10 that the enemy comes only to seek to kill and destroy. But I am come that they might have life, and they might have life more abundantly. And then he says, I'm the good shepherd. But we really are in watching our world, a battle between good and evil, and it's being played out in many different arenas, but this is one of the arenas. And we've gotten to learn a lot tonight, so I hope you'll tuck these things in your heart, digest it, and then maybe go back and watch it, but also share it with others. Share it with others so they get to hear. There's things that I learned that I didn't know before tonight, and it was helpful. And so I trust that you will do the same. I'd like to just have us to stand and close with a word of prayer and ask for safety as we go. As you leave tonight, the ushers will be by the door. We're going to take up just an offering for Uri. And so as you leave, the ushers will be by the door. You can also give online and give to love offering if you'd like to do it that way. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this night that we've just been able to learn details about what's been going on in our world. Lord, you said that you sit in the heavens and you laugh at the advances of the pagans, of the godless. And Lord, I know that you will bring justice. You've promised that. You will deal. I pray in this time that you would give wisdom to leaders, that we'd be able to see justice in our day. And we pray for the people of Jerusalem and Israel, those that have lost family members, have seen atrocities that they'll never be able to get out of their memories. I pray that you would help them and draw them to yourself. I pray that you would give comfort and grace. And I pray also that you would raise up in our country those who would support. I pray for Christians, Bible believers, to find their voice and to speak support and to pray publicly for the peace of Jerusalem. And so we just ask these things knowing that you can do it, and we submit it to you. Lord, give us safety as we travel. Pray that you give safety to Uri as he travels to Texas, and that you continue to help him as he spreads this presentation. Thank you for this time together tonight, and I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you.